here. And we're live.
Perfect. Well, we are live, and I want to thank everyone for showing up, coming out virtually, and participating in this grand event today with these legendary scholars. And this forum is to give us an opportunity to talk about what this COVID-19 pandemic, what it means and what it has meant to populations, diverse populations, underserved populations. And I thought, what better group to come together to talk about what's going on by way of COVID and how it's impacting our communities, particularly our communities of color, than these Black center directors and professors and scholars who all are not only tackling these issues on their respective campuses, but are doing some things to move the needle nationally to ensure that populations of color are still being served in key and important ways. So today's panel, we have legendary scholars, Dr. Chance Lewis, Dr. Luke Wood, Dr. James L. Moore, and we will, this is part one, today, the 13th. Part two will be a week later on the 20th with a different set of scholars, but still continuing with the same conversation about what it means to tell our stories, to tell our narratives, to tell our counter narratives about success and what we need to do to ensure that our communities are being successful. So with that said, I want to turn it over. I know we only have an hour, so we got a long way to go and a short time to get there. And what I would like to do is to have each one of the center directors to introduce themselves, give their title, and just give a, and also give the name of their respective centers. So with that said, I'll turn it over to Dr. Moore, Wood, and Lewis.
Good afternoon. Thank you, Dr. Bonner, for inviting me to be a part of this timely discussion. My name is James Moore. I'm the Executive Director for the Todd Anthony Bell National Resource Center on the African American Male. So I wear many hats, but this is a hat that I hold in very high esteem. I'm also the Vice Provost for Diversity Inclusion and Chief Diversity Officer at The Ohio State University. On the academic side of things, I'm the EHE Distinguished Professor for Urban Education, and that is my academic role. So I'm delighted to be here. Look forward to participating in the discussion with the other esteemed panelists.
Excellent. Thank you, Dr. Moore.
Okay. Good afternoon. My name is Chance Lewis. I'm so honored to be a part of this historic event. My current role, I currently serve as the Executive Director for my center, the Urban Education Collaborative at the University of North Carolina at Charlotte. In my faculty role, I currently serve as the Carol Grodness-Belk Distinguished Professor of Urban Education at UNC Charlotte.
Perfect. Welcome and thank you, Dr. Lewis.
Thank you.
Hi, everybody. This is Luke Wood. I serve on the faculty at San Diego State as a Distinguished Professor of Education. I also co-direct a center along with my colleague Frank Harris III called the Community College Equity Assessment Lab, a research and practice center focused on supporting community colleges across the country on racial equity issues. And in terms of the administrative side, I serve as Chief Diversity Officer and AVP for Diversity and Innovation for the university.
Excellent. Thank you and welcome, Dr. Wood. And I am Fred Bonner. I'm a professor endowed chair in the Whitlow R. Green College of Education at Prairie View A&M University, where I also serve as the MACH-III Center Director And MACH-III stands for minority, achievement, creativity, and high ability. And the 3 is a focus on students, faculty, and administration. So without further ado, we will jump right in and kind of go, this is a fishbowl. And I want the panelists to know that, you know, we don't have to, we don't have to have the questions in any particular order. So just speak what's on your heart and share what's on your spirit. So but the very first question I'd like to start with, the focus of this town hall is about counter narrative and telling the counter narratives from your positionalities as center directors. So we know from the literature, from the research, that Salazano and Yoso and also Given, they define counter narrative as stories or narratives that disrupt what we perceive to be the fundamental truth or traditional ways of thinking and doing. So as you think very deeply about counter narratives, those stories that you're telling and the things that you're doing to disrupt some of those dominant narratives, or as Christine Stanley said years ago in her article, when counter narrative meets master narrative, you know, we need to disrupt those narratives that tell a story that don't reflect what we are doing in our communities. So with that said, what would be your counter narrative as a center director, as a professor, as a Black male? What is your counter narrative in this age of COVID-19?
Well, I'll start off for us. This is Chance Lewis, and two kind of narratives I want to put out just to start the conversation. When we look at COVID-19 and the impact on our respective communities, two kind of narratives I think are very important for us to consider, especially since I know we have a lot of educators watching. Counter narrative number one that I want to put out just from my seat as a center director is that I'm seeing many parents, particularly parents in the Black community, who really want their children to continue their academic achievement without drop off. And that's very important for us to put out there because I know many parents personally and those that I'm interacting with through my role as center director that they're making adjustments to how they're functioning on their jobs just to make sure their children are having the right kind of academic experiences, you know, from their particular school as everybody tries to figure this out. And then the second kind of narrative I want to put out there is the hard work and the adjustment that educators, particularly teachers, are having to do in this time period, because I was on another recent Zoom call and educators are now basically saying that they're working multiple shifts in providing instruction, the normal daytime for those students who can get access to them, but then also at night, because some parents have to support their children in the evening or at the night time to do their work as well. So those are two kind of narratives that I want to just start our conversation off with, because it doesn't get the press that it should about how people are stepping up to the plate, such as parents and educators, to meet the academic needs of our children in our communities.
Thank you for that, Dr. Lewis. And I know all the hard work that you do, and particularly your background in urban education and everything you've done with teachers, students of color, and schools. Your insight is quite profound and actually very, very timely. So we appreciate all that work that you're doing and that your center is doing.
Thank you.
Welcome.
Well, what I would say is that, you know, there are many counter narratives, and I'm not unique to having a counter narrative. You know, when you put Blackness and maleness in a context, too often in an American society, we always begin to associate a doom and gloom. You know, life on the margin is an unpleasant reality for so many Black males in America. And too often we have to talk about the exceptionalities that we present to the table and the resiliency and the resolve. But I must say that it's important that we recognize it's not without psychological, emotional, and sometimes financial costs on individuals because of what they're constantly trying to push and the counter. And I think there are many examples that we can see in society that took place pre-pandemic, and we see continuously after the pandemic. And the serious situation in Georgia where the individual was shot and killed, and just thank goodness that someone videotaped it, because those individuals will probably, have gotten off, and we potentially would have had individuals that committed a serious crime free. I think these are the constant challenges that cuts across generations that individuals have to overcome. And when I think about it is that the coronavirus pandemic heightened the inequities in our educational system and beyond. I can say in our beloved Ohio, we can look at, I work very closely with some of our largest urban school districts in the United States, where you see heightened levels of vulnerability among the students, not because they don't have the capacity, it's because these are school systems that too often is already under-resourced, and the students automatically start behind. For example, these inequities, they weren't as visible as they are now. And right now, as a result of the pandemic, most of us are confined to a same space and time over a repetitive period of time. And in turn, we have more time to see and reflect. And in this time, I'm having discussions with educators and non-educators, as well as my own children, where you can't see now because my wife is I like to think the parents are the original university, and the learning starts in the parent womb, right? And so in turn, my wife, in her instinctive nature, has converted my living room into a dance studio in a schoolhouse. And it takes me down in memory lane when you talk about counter narratives, Black women, single, married, or those who even who have children or who serve as mother-like figures, have played tremendous roles in educating Black men and Black children in particular. When I think about in our household, we have Wi-Fi, we have the best internet access known to my area. And when I think about other homes, no Wi-Fi, no telephones in some cases, and nevertheless, a laptop to do their work. In some of our districts in Ohio, there's no learning going on right now. And in fact, some of my students, because no learning is going on in schools across America, they're working in fast food restaurants, they're working in grocery stores, so they can fill in the gap financially in their households. So psychologically, emotionally, they can't think about their learning. So learning gains is not going to be lost just in the summer, and Dr. Lewis writes a lot about that. They're losing learning gains right now. And guess what? Who's going to right the wrong? No one. And we got some students, if you go to our website, part of my role has been the vice provost in one of our renowned programs, the Young Scholars Program, because students are grieving, regardless of the social context they come from, whether they live in the suburbs, they go to private schools, charter schools, public school. They're mourning because they lost prom year. They lost significant award ceremonies. They lost signing their yearbooks. they lost significant moments. And if you go to our website, the genius of our staff, they gave students an opportunity to write a letter, and it's called Dear Senior Year. And they get to write and reconnect with those experiences. Where are the psychologists? Where are the mental health professionals for these students who have to live in homes that they're expected to learn where there's no learning going on? And then the second piece is some families got 3 or 4 kids in the household. In one of our districts, they can only get 1 laptop per household. Now, that couldn't work in the Moore household because we already, every morning, I got mayhem going on. But I go to the superintendent of the house, my wife, and she diffuses the mayhem. And one, because my children got 2 parents that are in the house, that we can distribute some of the guidance and support and tutoring or that we provide for our households. With some households, the parents are not able to do that because they have to make sure that people like me and others are able to maintain the life that we have, like the people who work in the grocery store, to ensure that we have groceries, the people who work in the gas stations and those things. Right now, this is the first time in history, and I'll close on this, is that we get to celebrate individuals who oftentimes are virtually invisible in our day-to-day, and much of the work that they do in our life today to maintain the quality of life that many of us are able to have. We get to recognize how significant those roles are.
Excellent. Thank you, Dr. Moore. And the work that you do and the work that you have been doing on populations of all students, from those who are academically challenged, particularly those who are academically gifted. Your work is making such an impact and is so important to what we're doing. So I really appreciate your insight and giving us some strategies and some good things to think about by way of how we reach all the students, not just those who have access and who have resources.
So I can add to this. 2 things that kind of stand out to me is, one, I think that there is a continued need to focus on racial equity. And I think that in a time like this, it becomes easy for administrators to not see that as something that's important. I know within my own circles and the folks that I'm engaging with, the focus is on how do we do and respond in very quick ways. And when that happens, I think that a lot of things that deal with equity tend to fall through the cracks. But I think that right now, and Frank and I both talked about this in the work that we're doing, is that racial inequity is probably greater now than ever before. If we just think about like the conditions for implicit bias, even like the subtle forms of it, that implicit bias is most likely to occur when there are 3 conditions that are in place. 1, when we have incomplete information. 2, when our time is constrained. And 3, when we're experiencing stress or our cognitive control is somehow compromised. And so when we think about those conditions, those are now more prevalent than ever before. So we should realize that biases are happening even more, and that the ways that educators are engaging students, I think about it in the higher ed context, how faculty are engaging students in terms of, you need to have a camera in order for us to be able to monitor you to make sure that you're not cheating, or the quick responses and emails that may be flippant, or just the overall engagement can be done in ways now that I think is more demeaning. Now, the second part of it is a little bit different than Brother Moore here, because I do agree that there's some major challenges, but I also see the good in what's taking place right now, more so in early learning. So I'm switching now from like the community college level to early childhood, where, you have Black children who go oftentimes into schools where they're treated poorly. We talk about, distrust, disdain, and disregard. Distrusting them in terms of assumptions of criminality, disdain in terms of seeing them as being lesser than, and disregard in terms of their academic intelligence. And one of the things that I've seen with a number of, particularly kids in early childhood, is that their confidence is growing because they're simply not in an environment where they're constantly being drawn down. So yes, there is the flip side of that where they're not getting the education that they deserve right now, but they're in some ways they're also not being battered in the ways that they continually are battered. And now, of course, that doesn't transfer across the whole pipeline, but I do see that as something, as a pattern that I'm seeing in ECE.
Excellent, Dr. Wood. And you two are one of our educational legends who's actually out there making a difference for kids across the, well, people, I should say, across the P20 pipeline. Not only have you, does your work influence what's going on in our P12 schools, but particularly as we look at community colleges and four-year institutions, your insight and impact are refreshing just to see the perspective that you bring, and especially since you looking geographically, you know, there as we look at the issues are the issues, but when we look at regional variations, what's going on in California versus what's going on here in Prairie View, Texas, there are some differences, but you know, it seems like what you're doing brings a holistic perspective that can that translates and is transferable to all of our different contexts. So thank you for all that work, your hard work. So with that said, I will, and just very, very quickly, I'll just give a very brief counter narrative and we'll jump into the questions. When I think about what we're facing and how we're having to tackle COVID-19, and one of the very first things that came to mind when I listened to very, very early on, some of the lessons and the things that were coming from the CDC, coming from the powers that be about, oh, this is what you need to do. You have to wash your hands, you have to shelter in place, you have to engage in social distancing. And when I think about the elders and how I was raised and who raised me, you know, a lot of these lessons and things that they were saying was going to be our new normal, when I thought about Black folks and the Black communities I came from, this new normal was my always normal. So I can remember having a grandmother there in East Texas, in Linden, Texas, saying things like, boy, don't you come in this kitchen before you wash your hands. And I can remember, you know, when you think about it, Black folks, we've had shelter in place going way back in the day because our parents would say, you know, if you're not home before these street lights come on. So we had our own version of shelter in place. And this whole communal notion of education has to be part of we have to be part of these networks to make it happen and make it happen in ways that are going to be effective. Well, we've always ascribed to that. It takes a village to raise a child. It takes a village to raise our communities. So all this social networking that we're doing by way of virtually now, in our communities, think about it, we've been doing that for quite some time. And Dr. Moore and Dr. Wood touched on this. Cultural and social capital, many times people of color, our communities, we're left out of those conversations because sometimes there's this assumption that our communities give us nothing, but we know that's absolutely positively not true. We have cultural and social capital, but our cultural and social capital sometimes comes in very different ways. So I was planning to work on this article. I've been tossing this around for years, and it's an op-ed piece. And it kind of was sparked by a conversation that my mother had with one of my cousins years and years ago. And she talked about how, I don't know if y'all remember those, the old encyclopedias. So my father he was my high school assistant principal. My mother was a teacher there in the school. So in our community, you know, a lot of the kids would come to our house to borrow books, to borrow things. And my mom talked about how important it was for, you know, her being a teacher and my father being a principal, for us to always be those community liaisons who ensured that all the kids in the community had access and had resources that many of them didn't have in their home. So my mom made this statement to my cousin. She said, you know, it's always been about sharing and ensuring that the kids in the neighborhood were taken care of. So she said, you know, I'm still looking for my S. So whenever she said that, I laughed. I was like, she is still looking for that S encyclopedia. Someone borrowed it and never brought it back. But as a community, as Black folks, that's just what we did. So all these things and all these lessons that we're supposedly just now learning because of COVID-19, no, y'all, we have actually been doing this stuff for a long, long time. So if I had to codify or provide a moniker for my narrative, it would be, my soul looks back and wonders how we made it over, because that's what we need to do. We need to go back and look at the things that we have historically done by way of education, by way of community, by way of uplift, because as people of color, we've always known how to make it in hard times.
One thing I'd just like to add, and thank you for sharing that, is that I think, you know, because of the pandemic, it's viewed as we all are equally impacted, right? Because some of our lives have been constrained in ways that they weren't constrained, particularly when you have access to privilege and opportunities. As a result, but we still get to see the class lines of the vulnerabilities. And not only that, we just assume, let's disproportionately, if you Black and male, it's less likely you might live if you get the coronavirus, because that demographic group tend to be the most impacted. And let's face it, because these are things that I have heard. Some are so terrified, if I get the coronavirus, will I get the adequate care that I deserve? Because there's a leeriness, right, that's in the air that we have never been able to escape in American society around our trust around medical institutions. Mm-hmm. And then not only that, we have this narrative. It's a broad, vast narrative. And you hear from the most powerful people in the world about where that this virus was created. Now, for certain communities, that has psychological and emotional triggers. And some of these communities, when you talk about cultural, yeah, we've always had the cultural pieces about, yeah, my grandma can see it. Not only did she tell us to wash our hands, she watched us and showed us how to wash our hands, right?
Absolutely.
I don't think they teach that in kindergarten anymore, but we learned this at a very early age. But some of the things that are what makes our community even more and more, and I can tell you this personally, I've lost 2 people to the coronavirus. And so I know it impacts me personally. And many have some of the risk factors that put them at greater risk than others. When I hear about people protesting, and I understand protests, I understand the reason why, because if your job or your future and things that you built, and it took almost a lifetime to build, and you watch it, you lose it overnight, it will make individuals to result to behaviors that they otherwise would not result to. So I understand that. And so, but what we're not understanding when these people we're complaining, disproportionately, the people who are in harm's way are the working poor, the working class folks who come from communities like where I came from. Now, I don't live in my small town in South Carolina anymore, but I send emails and talk to my sister frequently. And people go into Walmart and Target and have no mask on because she'll take a picture. It's almost as if our system has misinformed. This is anti-intellectual kind of mantra going on that say we don't want to listen to science. And in turn, communities like ours are being impacted because we're not shattering the myths and sharing the apparent realities that this virus will take us out. And guess what? We all need to walk very cautious. Not that we need to stop living, because until we get a vaccine.
Exactly. Excellent. Excellent. So panelists, one question that I have for you, and we've actually, all of us have kind of touched on this, but I want to drill a little bit deeper. So the question is, so we have folks on from schools, school districts, communities from Texas, Houston, Texas, all the way to Chicago, Illinois. And one of the questions that I want to ask, because we have so many folks in the P12 context on, what advice would you give to our P12 audiences as they tackle the challenges and continue to strive for achievement and excellence during this COVID-19 era? P12, what advice?
I'll start off. Just a few quick strategies. I provided a link to an op-ed I published this week on this particular topic, COVID-19 and some educational inequities. So you could take a look at that, but I'm gonna just reference a few for us that were kind of alluded to, and I wanna just draw some further context to it.
Excellent, Doc.
Number one is the digital divide is real. And by being real, what I mean by that, while school districts should be commended for their efforts to take on this challenge to try to get students laptops, you got to think about it though. What good is a laptop without internet access or high-speed access?
Absolutely.
So it's just, at the end of the day, it's just a glorified paperweight. So
Absolutely.
as you start to look at it, one of the things we have to consider then is that advice going forward, many schools around the country are what they call one-to-one school, one student, one device. But as we garner the resources, one of the things we have to do is how can we also provide hotspots, for these students to gain internet access at a speed that is usable, because oftentimes if they're accessing from phones, many online course management software is not mobile friendly. So we got to think about that. Number two, advice that we got to think about, access to food is real, okay? We need to think about how do we expand in our schools and communities, giving students access to nutritious meals. I know many schools across the country have established feeding sites, but when we look at that, we got to think about where are the feeding sites located? How are students able to get there? So we got to think about that from a standpoint. So my advice would be strategically formulate a plan in your local community of how we're going to serve everyone with our students as they go forward. Number three, I want to point out just really quickly is how are students going to get access to specialized support services? It could be gifted services, it could be mental health services, it could be special education services, IEPs, whatever that is. But one of the things I would say from that advice standpoint, now is the time to be innovative, because as we start to look at that, these students still have the same needs, but now they're amplified even more based on all of this trauma that is now layered on top of it. So we have to think about how we're going to provide those specialized support services that school districts are still getting funding for, that it still has to be distributed to the students. And then fourth thing is that what does a structured learning environment at home look like? Okay, we need to provide guidance on what that looks like. Okay, because having a nice office at home, that's not everybody's reality. So what we need to do, because parents want to know, right? What does that look like, and what's the best situation I could put my kid in to have a structured learning environment? But we also cannot forget, we have a good percentage of students who are homeless. Okay, so how does that look in that? And I'll close with this on advice for us to consider, is that right now in the PK through 12 environment, as we provide students instruction and access, basically I read this in a social media post recently. They said, right now, all we are grading academically is privilege, right? And because you're grading privilege, who has access to the internet and have access to those things. So the evaluation system is all tied to privilege and how the privileged are performing on the range of academic measures. But what about if we layer another aspect of that for all those students that we're not serving, how we're going to measure their academic achievement. So my advice on that particular point is that this is the time where stakeholders from at the top of the state, at the state education departments, all the way down to the local schools, are going to have to reinvent grading and evaluation system to equitably, assess all the students that we have in our schools. And I'll stop at that point.
Excellent, Dr. Lewis, excellent. And just as a counterpoint to what you just said, you gave a very good rendering of what we should be thinking about by way of our P-12 schools. So what about our post-secondary institutions, panelists? So what should we be thinking about? What should we be doing in this COVID-19 era for our higher ed institutions, for our post-secondary institutions to ensure excellence and success?
Well, I can weigh in on that first. I mean, from the educator standpoint, it looks very different, right? I think that there's a need to be far more high touch than normal, recognizing that we can't allow students to fall through the cracks. So one of the things that I have my team doing, for example, is we call our students of color every week. We are either calling them, texting them, live chatting with them, just check in on them, see how they're doing, find out what the problems are that they're having, connecting them to campus resources that they might need. So I think being intrusive or high touch is the first part of it. I think being responsive to the needs that they have. So, it's obviously been mentioned issues around technology, in terms of a computer, Wi-Fi, whatever the challenges are, but it's being responsive in a quick time frame and not letting too much time go by. I think it's being informed about what the needs actually are, rather than basing things on anecdote or what sounds good or what someone saw on Facebook. I think it's being race conscious, recognizing that race is a limiting, a defining factor. And I think that the other panelists have talked about that pretty extensively. I think it's recognizing that students are experiencing multiple home pressures. There's issues around loss of jobs. There's multiple people who are working in, who are either occupying the same space, trying to do class or to do work, whatever they might be doing in the same place. So there's no real quiet spaces for people to be able to do. It's far more stressful. I think that we have to recognize that that's what's taking place for our students, but it's also taking place for the educators who are working with them and the staff who are supporting them. So it's everybody's experiencing that. So I do think that we have to be far more intentional about what we're doing right now, recognizing that it is a challenging time. And I also think we have to be really thoughtful about there's no real quiet space. Mental health issues, with the stress that comes with this situation. I think that we're seeing a lot of issues with depression, anxiety that are coming out. I think there's a feeling of hopelessness for some of our students. I think recognizing that all that is occurring. So we have to have grace for our students and also have a little bit more grace for ourselves. And then kind of lastly, in the pre-K-12 context, I think for parents, part of the goal is to make sure you're getting the kids outside in places where you can and really have them expel some of that energy. Because being inside all day in front of school, which is now of course on a screen, and then of course a lot of kids now are getting a far more screen time, whether it's on their device, whether it's on the TV. So getting kids outside, getting that energy expelled, I think particularly for boys, but really for all kids, I think is really important right now.
Excellent, excellent. Another question, panelists, and this kind of pulls it back in, a focus on your particular center and what your center is doing, your centers are doing in response to COVID-19. So kind of give us a perspective of what does your center do and what is your center doing? Are you doing anything different to help our communities respond to this pandemic? So. in particular, a focus on your center.
Brother Moore, you want to go first?
Sure. Well, our center, the Todd Anthony Bell National Resource Center on the African American male, and our vision is to become the premier resource on African American males throughout the lifespan. And when you began to examine what resources around the nation, there's not very few centers that focus specifically on African American males. And so we were founded as an initiative to address some of the educational challenges that Black males experience at institutions like Ohio State University. I'm proud to say that nearly 1,300 Black male undergraduate students, nearly 50% of them have a cumulative 3.0 or better. I would argue this is very few universities, and I'm not going to count universities who only got 10 brothers. And so I think, so out of that, we've always spent a lot of time in creating programs and initiatives that could be scaled and replicated. We have a Black Male Project that's kind of stalled right now, that we're looking at what are the factors that contribute to their success. Because there are some Black males achieve in spite of, right? And most research, and I think we can look at Dr. Sean Harper, he's focused on those high achieving. And I know Dr. Bonner, you focus on high achieving. It's sort of like in this work, we're looking at all levels of achievement. It's sort of like the continuum. We got so tired of talking about the ones who didn't achieve, but what about those who come from the same conditions, same context as in spite of? And so now I think we're this narrative that we focus on the high achievers, right? But what about those in the middle, right? That they're achieving, but what are the factors that impact us? So that's the Black Male Project. And we also have a K-12 project in which we're looking at gifted and talented students in an urban school system. And you would think that the literature would be salient, looking at Black males in the gifted space, and particularly in urban schools. But that the research is scant at best when you're talking about urban school districts. In fact, you can look at urban school districts where the school districts are predominantly Black males are still grossly underrepresented in gifted and talented programs. There are a number of explanations for that. A lot of our work right now is focused on the programmatic efforts, not as much external, but we have been providing some technical assistance. It's not like we've been very deliberate, but we get phone calls and families, and they're wondering what are the best mechanisms to ensure that their kids don't lose the gains, or how do I keep my son who suffered from attention deficit disorders, and now he has to be on a computer for upon hours. Wow. What are some things that I can do as a parent to think about it? I think to get at a question that I didn't respond to, I think educators, they should create support groups within it that they can draw off the best practices. And I think principals should do it, because let's face it, all of us, man, I'm so ready to go to work because I'm not used to my kids being around me so long. So I don't know what else about everybody else is thinking. I love my kids, but I won't take nobody else's kids now. So I'm saying that about my own blood, but the fact of the matter is we're talking about these specific things and we're trying to put it in place. Because I wear multiple hats from my vice provost level. We have one of the largest pipeline programs in the country. We have about 1,500 kids in our pre-collegiate program, and then we have about 400 in our collegiate program. And right now, I like to see the work we do is mission critical. And a lot of universities decide not to cancel summer programs. And those summer programs historically have bridged a lot of gaps for young people. And not only kids who may not have access, for kids who might not be well represented in some disciplines like STEM. These programs give you early exposure. and awareness to things that you otherwise would have foreclosed on if you didn't have it. So I made a bold decision long before the university made a decision that we were going to do online. But again, I didn't have necessarily the money like most states around the country. We're expecting major budget cuts, and we're doing contingent budget planning right now. And we're running various scenarios. Those scenarios could be catastrophic for the work that I do. And so I think, how many proposals? Because I think we need leadership in our communities, in our centers, in our universities, more so than ever before. And I think a good example of this, I think everybody is tired of reruns on TV, and every Sunday, everybody is gravitating to ESPN to watch The Last Dance. And I think Michael Jordan said it best, not necessarily some of the things he did. You know, some of us, we can be critical, but one thing he said best is that those who are critiquing, they probably ain't never won anything. And so it's a lot of critiquing right now. You got to make decisions. And so those decisions, we done wrote about 5 or 6 proposals, and we need the philanthropic community to be more accessible and to really think about not changing their rules, but making some exceptions, because units like mine, as well as others across the country, we're looking for resources. And I know a lot of the resources right now, because I've communicated with a lot of leads in the philanthropic community, they're putting money in food, right? Because people are hungry. They're focusing on the day-to-day. But I think we need leadership to think about not the day-to-day. We need to think about a future. There's 3 moments in time that our lives are forever impacted by: the past, the present, and the future. And we can't compromise the future because we so fixed on the present moment. The pandemic, some of us will be around, unfortunately, because I hear straight Darwinism, and I counter that narrative. And this is Darwinism, what we're in the midst of. And people look at me and say, what are you talking about? When I hear people talking about, we used to talk about flatten the curve. And I know as researchers, we understand what that means. But now we don't talk about flatten the curve. That's not the motivation now. The motivation is our tolerance level. Our motivation is our threshold, so we won't overwhelm the system. So that says we got this baseline where we're saying we're going to accept that people are going to get sick, and we're going to accept that people are going to die. And as I would say to anybody, as a researcher, as a behavioral science trained person, is who wants to be the guinea pig? And I think as centers, we have to be, Dr. Lewis is doing it. I know Dr. Wood does it. I know you do it, Dr. Bonner. Write opinion pieces. These opinion pieces are very important, and we need to move people into action. The last thing I would say that that I'm really interested in, and I've been thinking about what are the best mechanisms, is important that we continuously communicate to federal agencies and to convey to them how they need to provide some kind of provisions in some of their public policies to ensure. Now, because of the pandemic, the first thing we're going to cut across America, and we're going to cut higher education, we're going to cut K-12 education. So we're going to impact the most vulnerable, and the institutions that have the most resources, the most poison, the most creativity. Those are the universities that will survive. For example, the vulnerability that we're constantly seeing as center directors, we should do more than just research, right? We should be helping provide technical assistance, translating our research for people so they can move into action. I think K-12 educators, we need to help them with thinking about the best approaches. But the first starting point that I would say that each and every one of us, we have to be cognizant there's only so many days in an hour. And when you work from home, you tend to work even more hours. Trying to make something happen, and we confined to the phone, confined to the Zoom, is that first of all, we have to really model self-care.
Absolutely.
This stuff, if you don't die from the coronavirus, you could die from a heart attack.
Exactly.
So I'll stop there, but I think as center directors, there's things that we need our learned societies to come together around and ask the federal government not to make certain specific cuts. And not only that, we need to prioritize what Bill Gates tried to do with the Gates Foundation. Is how, you know, at first it just seemed like it's far-fetched, is how do we create a world-class online education? And that's, in some places have done that. Well, some institutions of higher learning and even some K-12 places have been reluctant and resistant. And the people who have been the most resistant, most reluctant, those institutions are struggling.
Absolutely, absolutely.
I'll jump in from our center's perspective. For those who are watching, I'm the center director at the Urban Education Collaborative at the University of North Carolina at Charlotte. And one of the things that we've seen to try to support our communities is really have a focal point on a whole new wave of professional development needs of K through 12 districts. So we are focusing in on the technical assistance side. So basically what I already started doing, you know, pre-COVID-19 was to offer a series of professional development trainings that were virtual for school districts and could be provided on demand. And so, for example, I'll give you an example what I'm talking about here. So we have in my center a culturally sustaining teaching certificate that is all online that school districts across the country access to provide the training necessary. But now when we talked about the cultural capital that our students from our communities bring, what does that look like in training and technical assistance to really provide guidance to educators on how that looks in a COVID-19 situation as they're putting instruction together, you know, online? You know, how are they taking the interest in that cultural capital that we talk about that the students bring and implement that into instruction? So that's one of the things that we are doing currently through our center in providing that to school districts. And one of the things we like to do is provide it on demand, because now having opportunities where many school districts now are reaching out because they have to justify paying educators when they're not in the building, right? So, and they still have professional development needs that are new and emerging that we're looking at. And then another one is how do you engage students of color in a productive way in this environment? You know, and that's another kind of set of trainings that we're doing. So those are just kind of a few examples of how we've kind of positioned our center to be right on the forefront of providing that technical assistance to school districts across the country. So, because since they can't gather together for your traditional professional development needs, you know, we position our center to provide it, you know, 24/7 on demand, on topics that are needed. And we have a mechanism where school districts can request certain topics where we could put trainings together as well. So that's what we're doing at this time.
Wow. And one of the things, thank you, Dr. Lewis. One of the things, just very quickly, the MACH-III Center is doing at Prairie View A&M is you see on the screen Dr. Stella Smith. She's the Associate Director of the MACH-III Center. And one research project that we actually started to engage right before all the COVID stuff happened is a hyperpoverty study that we titled The Principle of the Matter. So we're looking at principals in 6 hyperpoverty high schools there in the Houston area: Cashmere, Wheatley, Worthing, Booker T, Madison, and Yates. And the purpose of this study was to go in and find out what principals are doing in these minority serving, predominantly Black high schools. And we have a series of questions, 15, 20 questions, ranging from what are you doing to support gifted and talented? What are you doing to support special education? What are you doing to support STEM education? And all points in between. So that hyperpoverty study, we actually are taking that and expanding that. We just submitted an NSF grant looking at what it means to have a robust computer science program in those same hyperpoverty high schools. And what does that mean? So we're taking this model of hyperpoverty in the Houston area, and we're using it as a template for a lot of different foci. So principals, we're looking at computer science, And we're actually about to pull together the information for a NSF submission on mathematics. So we want to look at what it means to be to have a robust mathematics program in these very same hyper-poverty schools. So, and just as Dr. Moore said, as Dr. Lewis was saying, it's really, really important to get the research to translate to action. But we can't so many times, you know, actually, I got this from years and years ago when I was an assistant professor, first starting the tenure track at University of Texas, San Antonio. One of my good colleagues, Dr. Ray Padilla, I was talking to him about, you know, very early in my assistant professor days, and I was telling him I need to do more empirical research. I am doing empirical research, but I'm doing a lot of theoretical pieces, a lot of op-ed pieces. So I need to completely cut that off and get to doing just empirical pieces, collecting data, doing my qual, doing my quant work. And Dr. Ray Padilla said to me, he said, you know what? Absolutely do that, but don't cut off your theoretical, because he said, people of color, we are many times not given the luxury of theorizing about our own identities, about our own personalities and positionalities. So I think it's very, very important for us, you know, yes, move to action, but to continue to do the important research that we're doing in these centers and taking that research to show and affect change that leads to action that are really going to move these communities in viable ways.
Thank you. I'll also add something in here about our center, and I can keep it brief because I know we're running short on time. Again, with the Community College Equity Assessment Lab, co-directed with my colleague Frank Harris. And actually we owe our center model to Dr. Lewis, who a number of years ago, we had applied for, I think, 14 grants in a row without ever getting a hit. No, you know, there's not a lack of support from the work that we were doing. And I remember he said, you know, you all might do better with a service model, and gave us some suggestions on how to set that up. And that's what we transitioned to, and our center has flourished ever since. And so kind of in that same spirit, that's the work that we've been doing. A lot of what we've been providing is similar to what you hear here, except that, you know, our kind of space and domain is primarily community colleges. And so we've done 3 large-scale webinars focused on topics that we think are important for community college professionals. The first was on equity-minded teaching and learning in the online environment, and talking about strategies and practices that are important for educators to keep in mind. The second one was on equity-minded student services in the online environment, and talking about what are some support strategies, particularly for those in student affairs, that they can employ, or for frontline staff in general. And then the third one was on responding to racial bias and microaggressions in the online environment. And fortunately, we had a real good showing for those webinars, because in that community college space, there just isn't a lot that's happening. And so we've been able to help to shore up some of that. So the first webinar, we had 4,000 people who participated. The second one had 5,000, and the third one was even bigger than that. I posted in the Facebook links to anybody wants to check them out. But it's really just getting information and strategies for people who are on the ground. You know, there's a lot of really good people who want to know what to do, and they need some guidance. And so, you know, for them, we specialize in trying to provide that, while also recognizing that we can give you strategies, but sometimes strategies can arm you to do more damage than good. It's been very common in our work, and Black men in particular, where we go to a college and they'll say, "Hey, can you give us like a one-page sheet on how to teach or work with Black men?" And I remember one time Frank and I were working on like a one-page document. They're like, "Why are we doing this?" And we stopped doing it because we realized that, you know, you can tell someone what to do, but if they haven't addressed what are more deeper issues, then they're actually going to just do more damage. I think the perfect example of that is that we were working with a college, and Frank had done a session on college men and masculinities, and looking at how masculine identity influences student outcomes and different ways to support men. and with a focus on men of color. And then it was like a flex day. So a faculty member went to that one, and then they went to another one after that that was focused on building relationships with students outside of the classroom. And the person who did that lecture or session just said, you know, if you see a student, make sure you go and you engage them, you say hi, you make a connection, which is important. It's true. And we all know that that's true. So this faculty member happened to be a white male faculty member with a good heart, right? I mean, good intentions, super charged up. The first student I see, I'm going to engage them. I'm going to say something positive to them. Walks out of the training and sees a black male. I'm like, oh, there's one. Walks over to them, says, hi, I'm so-and-so. I teach here. I hear you guys have problems asking for help. So,
oh, no.
What I have to do is to build a relationship with you. So what sport do you play?
Oh, Lord.
Right. And so you can tell people strategies, right? But if they haven't addressed their perceptions in terms of how they view themselves and how they view the students that they're working with, then again, you can do more damage. And so on all of our webinars, and I'm sure, and all the other folks there here materials, it's that trying to strike that balance between engaging those deep perceptions as well as providing strategies that work, because ultimately we have to be really careful about how we do that with audiences that really aren't ready to engage diverse students.
Well, everyone, I want to thank this brilliant band of brothers, my brothers, and thank you for tuning in. This hour has flown by because, like I said, we had a long way to go and a short time to get there. So, but I want to thank you, brothers, personally. I mean, you all are scholars, you all are contributing, and we're going to really pay attention to these lessons and these good pearls of wisdom that you've given us today. So, and with that said, I'd encourage everyone out there in cyberspace to tune in next week. It'll be another band of brothers plus a sister, our good friend, Dr. Ebony Zamani Gallagher. So tune in again. I appreciate y'all. If there are any questions out there, be sure to put those questions in the comments section. And Dr. Smith, and I want to personally thank my MACH-III team, Dr. Stella Smith. I couldn't make it without her. She's the backbone of all that we do in the MACH-III Center. And Mr. Norman Eaton. So thank you all. I appreciate y'all. Go out there, get something good to eat, and I'll see y'all soon.
Thank you, Dr. Bonner.
Thank you.